Well, hello once again, and welcome back to another exciting week of GB 102, Bible Backgrounds. In today's lecture, we'll be discussing marriage and family institutions of the Bible. In particular, we'll be discussing the family-oriented terms of the Old and New Testament, and we will be attempting to assert what the cultural norms were for family dynamics in both the Old and the New Testament. After that, we will contrast the Hebrew understanding of marriage and families with some of our modern ideas, noting both where they are similar and where they are different. And after unpacking all of that, we will conclude by discussing some of the theological implications of all this, primarily with regards to the modern debate of how to define a modern marriage. Now, let me begin by asserting that the most important reason to study marriage customs of the ancient Near East is because that these concepts of family and marriage saturate the biblical text. Nearly every book of the Bible describes family relationships, and it becomes apparent that when a student starts reading these texts for the first time, that they realize that a lot has changed culturally since the time of the Bible. Many of the family customs recorded in the Bible can strike modern readers as strange and crude and sometimes even barbaric. And this has led many people to question the validity of the idea of a biblical marriage entirely. Additionally, in the Bible, one of the most common metaphors for God's relationship with his people is the metaphor of the husband and a wife. And this has led to quite a lot of theological speculation over the years concerning the nature of salvation, or soteriology, the nature of the end times, or eschatology, and even on the nature of humanity, or anthropology. In short, because every culture brings its own baggage and expectations to the study of this topic, it is crucial for us to attempt to see things from the biblical author's perspectives, and to try not to impose our own values and our own culture on the biblical text. Therefore, this concept of marriage and family will serve as a good demonstration for our historical critical method that we introduced last week, because it is only when we understand the original meaning and the original ideas behind this idea of marriage that we can then try to unpack that and say what it means to us today. But before we begin with that, I wanted to give a slight warning of caution here that this topic can be a hot-button issue. In American politics, the question of how to define a marriage or a family has been a driving force for the past 20 years or so. And in many ways, one of the primary distinctions between what it means to be a liberal and a conservative in this country often comes down to a stance on what position a person takes on this issue. So, with that being said, since this discussion could get politically charged and heated, I will simply ask that all posts and discussions on this topic remain good-natured. Please respect one another when you're responding in the forum here after this lecture. And when you find yourself disagreeing, please use biblical evidence when you try to argue your points. And above all, respond to other people with love. I've come to the conclusion over the years that no one has ever really convinced a person by yelling at them, and such behavior will not be tolerated in the discussion forums. Alrighty then, so now with that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about some of the major biblical terms for family relationships. Now, at its most basic core, the family unit consisted of a husband and a wife. The Genesis account of the first family uses these terms, husband or man, and wife, and many other biblical personalities through the years, including Jesus himself, will refer to this first pairing as the norm. See Matthew 19:4-9 for more on that. Now, the Hebrew term is this word, ish, while the term for wife is this term, isha. Now, like our modern terms for man and woman, these Hebrew terms are cognates for one another, meaning that the words are linguistically related. Genesis 2:23 acknowledges this that it's more than just a linguistic dependence when Adam affirms that the woman has been created or taken from his own body. And he proclaims, "Therefore she shall be called Isha, because she was taken out of Ish. Now, of course, we know that this first couple makes some rather large mistakes. After the couple eats from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God pronounces a curse upon the man and the woman for their disobedience, and on the serpent who deceived both Adam and Eve in the first place. Now, the curse upon the woman is particularly interesting for our study because it implies the necessity for a hierarchy within the family, or a sense of structure and subordination. In the New English Translation, the interpretation of this verse reads as follows, quote, "To the woman God said, I will greatly increase your labor pains. With pain you will give birth to children. You will want to control your husband, but he will dominate you." Unquote. And the result of this is that nearly every family that's described in the Bible will be organized around a family structure known as patriarchy. Now, this is a Greek term that comes from the words pater, or father, and archon, which means ruler. Patriarchy. And with this underlying assumption that the husband is the ruler of the wife, children, slaves, and his property. Basically, the husband controls everything he owns. Now, I already anticipate a few groans from some of you because, well, let's be honest, this idea is horribly out of fashion with our culture. And we will discuss these theological implications at the end of this lecture, but for now, when we're just dealing with the facts and the biblical data, it is highly necessary to point out that this institution of father rule, patriarchy, is assumed to be normal by every author of every biblical book. And, quite frankly, it would not be controversial for any of them to just state this as the norm. It is simply how culture functioned in that time. So now, there will be numerous cultural results because of this institution of patriarchy. And among the most notable is that fathers will exert a great deal of influence over their children and their spouses. Just for one example, when Jacob sends his children to go get grain in Egypt, all 10 of his children that he sends are full-grown men. They've got families of their own. And even his youngest son, Benjamin, by this time has 10 kids and a beard. And yet Jacob can order him around like he's a 6-year-old and say, "Don't go. I don't want you to go down to Egypt with your brothers." And, well, one of the possible implications of this is that it should bring a radical understanding to the commandment, honor your father and mother. It doesn't end when you become an adult in the biblical world. In fact, a person's parents in the Bible, and especially the father of a child, could control their offspring all the way up until the father was deceased. Another example of how a father's word could be binding on his children was the case of the fatherly blessing. You see, in the ancient world, to give a blessing was a solemn and poignant experience, and it was expected that a father would not give a contradictory blessing. It was also expected that a father would not wish that all of his children did equally well. And this may explain the account of Genesis 27, where Jacob steals Esau's blessing. When Esau realizes that his brother has pulled one over on their blind father and taken his blessing, he asks his father, he says, quote, "Do you only have one blessing, father? Bless me too." Unquote. But for Esau, it's too late. Once his father has given the blessing, it can't be changed. It can't be revoked. And in this way, the fatherly blessing became highly coveted in the ancient world. And in the case of these blessings that are given in the Old Testament scriptures, they often carry the weight of a prophetic announcement. Now, when it came to the treatment of women in a patriarchal household, the amount of male control was much more acute than it was with boys. And some scholars have even gone so far as to suggest that in a patriarchal society, the women of the family, that means both wives and daughters, were treated more like property than human beings. And dozens of biblical examples can be mustered to demonstrate this. For example, a father could sell his daughter as a slave according to Exodus 21:7. Another example, a father or a husband could offer his wife or daughter to perform sexual acts in order to keep themselves safe or to keep their friends from harm, such as in the story of Lot trying to protect his visitors in Genesis 19, or the story of the Levite basically offering his concubine as a sexual toy to the men of Gibeah in Judges 18. And a third example, a father could even offer his daughter's hand in marriage as a reward, and this would be regardless of her feelings for the male suitor, and this can be seen in the case of Caleb and his daughter Achish in Joshua 15, or it could be seen in 1 Samuel 18, where Saul offered David his daughter Micah for an act of valor. And, well, while we're on the subject of difficult issues, one of the trickier aspects of this patriarchal system to reconcile with our own modern culture is that a woman could not end her marriage by seeking a divorce, at least during the Old Testament era and during the Apostolic era. Only the husband had the prerogative to divorce his wife. Now, this is very different from what we experience here in America, where women initiate 2/3 of all divorces in America, at least according to the National Center for Health Statistics. Now, there is one recorded example of a woman in the Bible running away from her husband, but she had little choice but to return back to her parents' house and to go back to being under the rule of her father. So, in this way, a woman was usually viewed as a form of property. She is either owned by her husband or her father, or in some cases by a male guardian. For example, Esther is under the guardianship of her uncle Mordecai in the book of Esther. And there is still a vestige of this state of affairs when we see couples having a traditional marriage today. A male guardian, who usually the father, gives the bride away when she walks down the aisle. For us today, though, this father giving the bride away is more of a token of parental support. But in the ancient world, it was a transaction. Another drawback of this understanding that a woman was property was that a man could theoretically take as many wives as he wanted, so long as he could afford it. Now, this notion of a man marrying multiple wives is known as polygamy, and many individuals during the Old Testament era practiced it. For example, Abraham had at least one wife and several concubines. Esau had 3 wives. Gideon had many wives. And King Solomon holds the biblical record with 700 wives, as recorded in 2 Kings 11, verse 3. So needless to say, this arrangement was far from equitable, because a woman could have only one husband at a time, and only in the case of divorce or the death of the first husband could the woman ever remarry. Additionally, the Old Testament is full of stories of unhappy polygamists. And as a result, many of the laws in the Old Testament that do permit polygamy are also focused on protecting the wife and the children of such marriages, as Exodus 21, 10 through 11 clearly does. Now, this problem of polygamy is further complicated for us today because the New Testament never officially prohibits the practice. And as such, many Protestant groups, when they've tried going back to a Bible-alone mentality, have had to wrestle with the implications that strict monogamy, as defined as one husband, one wife, for their entire lives, is an extra-biblical development, meaning that it develops slowly from scriptural implications, but not from an explicit "thus saith the Lord" mandate. And we will discuss this more when we cover the theological implications at the end of this lecture. So now, if all that business about polygamy wasn't complicated enough, there is also the issue that a status of a woman could often dictate what kind of wife she became. Several times in the Old Testament, a married woman is referred to by the term concubine instead of by the term wife. And it's somewhat hard to tell what the social rules were behind this designation exactly, save that it implies that the wife of lesser social standing is not accorded full privileges, and that's what this term concubine often relates to. So, for example, Jacob has 2 official wives, Leah and Rachel, but each of these girls also had a slave attendant. Both of these women allowed Jacob to have sexual relations with their female slave, and as a result, these two women, Zilpah and Bilhah, are counted as concubines, but not as wives. And as with polygamy, King Solomon also holds the biblical record for concubines at 300. And now, a final result of this institution of patriarchy is that the duty of priesthood, that a person could stand as an intercessor between human beings and between God, often falls on the father for his family. And this is most clearly seen in the book of Job, where Job offers sacrifices for the sins of his children, and he even offers sacrifices for sins they may have secretly done without his knowledge. Additionally, in Israel, if a vow was taken in God's name, in Yahweh's name, it became a binding oath. However, if a father or a husband heard about the vow from either their daughter or from their wife, they could simply nullify it the moment they first heard about the vow. And in this way, a father could fulfill a priestly role for his family. Now later, when Moses instituted the Levitical priesthood, this aspect of patriarchy will diminish as there will be an official priesthood over all of Israel to do this practice. But from time to time, it still shows up. For example, in 1 Samuel 1, 10 through 28, Hannah makes a vow to the Lord, and Elkanah, her husband, approves the vow and allows it to happen. So, let's shift gears here from talking about the men and go to discussing women and children. With all of this in mind about patriarchy, a lot of problems could instantly develop if the male of the household suddenly died, and especially if he had no adult male children who could take over his duties. The law of Moses therefore makes numerous provisions for the care of widows and for orphan children. The Hebrew words are almna for a widow and yatom for a orphaned child. And these laws are even repeated several times in the New Testament. For example, in Deuteronomy 14, there is a command for a special offering to be taken up every 3 years to support widows and orphans. Additionally, Deuteronomy 24 has a command that farmers are not to collect everything that grows in their field every year, but instead they're just to leave some things growing in their field so that widows and orphans can just walk right through their field and collect food for themselves. Similarly, in Acts chapter 6, one of the first early church controversies we see is them having to come to a decision on how they're going to care for the Greek and Hebrew widows equally. And another kind of side note, but it's telling to me that all of these laws go hand in hand with laws about foreigners. Essentially, widows, orphans, and foreigners all are on a nearly even playing field in that they had very few rights, and because of this, they had to depend on the goodness and the protection of others in order to survive. So now, if a woman had a husband who died and they didn't have any children at all, we have a very special problem that arises. Because if without any children, no one inherits the dead husband's land and property. And in order to keep the land in the family, the brother of the dead husband, or his nearest male blood relative, would be obligated to marry his brother's widow. This was often called a levirate marriage. A man who took up this duty for his close kin is known by a special term, a kinsman redeemer, or a goel. Some modern translations refer to this as the guardian of the family interest. Now, what would happen? This newly formed couple would mate and they would try to produce children. And if they had children, they would be considered the children of the dead brother for the purposes of inheritance. The book of Deuteronomy in chapter 25 even provides a law that if a woman could even publicly shame a kinsman redeemer who refused to take this responsibility seriously. This ritual involved the removing of a shoe and spitting in the uncooperative kinsman redeemer's face. Now, this may explain why in the book of Ruth, the closest kinsman redeemer to Ruth takes off his shoe and hands it to Boaz, a more distant relative, allowing Boaz to fulfill that duty for him. Additionally, this role of kinsman redeemer also applied to property as well as to slavery. Debt was a very serious problem throughout the ancient world, and people would frequently lose their land or even their freedom if they could not pay their debts back. Wealthy landowners could claim even more land, and they could even enslave their fellow Israelites simply by offering loans that would be difficult to pay back. And this may be why Proverbs chapter 22 verse 7 refers to being in debt as a form of slavery. And because of this, the role of the kinsman redeemer, the kinsman is charged with making sure that property does revert back to the family. And if a person has sold himself into slavery, the kinsman redeemer is responsible for paying the debt and setting them free. Now, theologically speaking, this idea of the kinsman redeemer will also take on a very interesting soteriological or salvation implication, as the prophet Isaiah will call Israel's God the kinsman redeemer for Israel. In fact, these texts, which start in Isaiah 44, it's repeated in Isaiah 48, Isaiah 49, and Isaiah 52, Isaiah predicts that the nation of Judah will be taken captive to a distant land of Babylon, and that they will become their prisoners, basically their slaves. Isaiah offers the people hope that one day God would redeem them, just like the guardian of the family interest, or the kinsman redeemer, would marry a hapless widow who had lost her husband. Alrighty, but what happens when the system is working well? What happens when the woman's husband died, but they had plenty of kids? Well, the firstborn male has a special privilege, and it's known as the birthright. And this meant that the oldest male, the firstborn male, gets twice as much inheritance. He receives both twice as much money and twice as much land as his brothers. And it's given to him for a specific purpose. He is responsible for taking care of his mother and his sisters until either they died or they were married off. And this idea of a birthright in Hebrew is known as the Bekrah. And it's somewhat fluid and it's transferable. For example, Esau is able to sell his birthright to his younger brother for the bargain price of a bowl of red stew. Likewise, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn son, loses his birthright and has it taken away by his father because he committed incest with Bilhah, one of his father's concubines. Now, when discussing inheritance, there's usually two types of inheritance in the Bible: money and land. And while monetary influence can theoretically come and go, the land is a lot more permanent, and it was supposed to stay a permanent aspect of a family's possessions. And in this way, a family could not lose their land. Laws were in place that even if the land was sold in order to cover a debt, it would revert back to the original family who owned it every 7 years, and on the year of Jubilee, every 50 years. Now, while some scholars question whether or not this was actually practiced, with any frequency at least, it certainly helps to explain passages in the Old Testament where godly people like Naboth refused to sell or to swap their inheritance when they were offered a better tract of land for it. Simply put, that inheritance was not to be bartered or sold. It was a gift from God. So, now that we've got all that basic vocabulary under our belts, let's take it for a test drive and discuss weddings in the Bible itself. One of the major surprises that people experience when they read through the Bible for the first time is that there is no detailed account of how to perform a wedding. Most of us are used to this ideal picture of a bride dressed in white, the groom in his tux, and up front there's the preacher performing the wedding service, and he usually has an open book. This book is usually not a Bible. It is called a service handbook, and most major denominations produce them in order to set the standard for how to do a wedding for their particular worship tradition. In case you were curious, yes, even the non-denominational Churches of Christ have several publishing companies that produce Churches of Christ service handbooks. And most of these handbooks are based off of an older Anglican prayer book, which is known as the Book of Common Prayer. And because of this, many of the pastor's words during a traditional wedding service sound nice and King Jamesy. For example, the opening line is almost always, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here this day." Now, it may sound old, but don't be fooled. Only the scripture readings in such services are actually found in the Bible. And even more interesting, when a person does a study of wedding traditions that are found in the Bible, we learn very quickly that the majority of the customs that we practice today are not in any way close to identical to the wedding practices that they practiced back then. So now, just in case you've never been to a wedding before, let me give you a very quick synopsis of how this usually works for our culture. This will allow us to compare and to contrast our modern wedding customs with the biblical wedding customs. So, for starters, for most of us, the wedding process begins when a boy meets girl and they fall in love. They go on dates, they make sure that they're compatible, they begin to do all manner of life together. They'll eat their meals together, they'll go shopping together, they'll begin to share their money and their resources. And supposedly, the glue that keeps it all together is love. Now, people in our culture will do almost anything in the name of love. And when love begins to grow cold or absent in a relationship, the couple will start to believe something has gone horribly wrong. And in most cases, couples will usually break up when one or both people start saying, "Well, I just don't know if I love them anymore." Now, as a contrast, many marriages in the biblical text are strangely reminiscent of Tina Turner's song, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" In fact, the first marriage in the Bible takes place not because Adam needs somebody to love, but because God says that Adam is alone. Now, don't get me wrong. Adam may very well have loved Eve, his wife. But my point is that the Bible never says that he did. And I find it ominous that the first time it's ever mentioned in the Bible that a husband loves his wife isn't until Genesis 24, a time dated to near the end of the early Bronze Age. And personally, I find it even more ominous that the Bible frequently tells readers that a husband or a wife is hated or unloved by their spouse. For example, Jacob wanted to marry Laban's daughter Rachel, but after the wedding feast, Leah, Laban's oldest daughter, is sent into Jacob's tent instead of Rachel. Now, he doesn't recognize the switch until the next morning, and he realizes he's had sex with the wrong person. Now, I know you're probably wondering, how did this happen? My guess is it's a combination of the darkness and the alcohol that usually accompany these kind of wedding parties that allowed this kind of ruse to succeed in the first place. But regardless, Jacob will argue with Laban, and eventually Jacob will also marry Rachel. Now he has two wives. And once married to both, the Bible will make it very clear that Jacob loved Rachel, but he does not love Leah. And God also seems to punish Jacob to some extent for this. And because of this, when Jacob has sexual encounters with Leah, they produce children. When he has encounters with Rachel, they initially do not. And I find it ominous that Leah will go so far when she has her first child, she just boldly proclaims that God has seen my misery, and now my husband will love me. So, in summary, while love could play a factor in these things, the Bible records plenty of marriages where love has absolutely nothing to do with the union. And in some cases, like with King Solomon, marriages can be made strictly for monetary gain or political power. And personally, I find this state of affairs, that love is not something you can take for granted in a biblical marriage, I think that this makes Paul's command in Ephesians 5:25-30 all the more profound. You see, if love is not necessarily going to be at the core of a wedding, it makes perfect sense that Paul should have to issue a command that husbands, you are to love your wife. And noting issues like this is highly important for biblical studies because today it has become very commonplace to denounce Paul and his writings for their sexist attitudes. Well, I would like to submit that in their original context, the letters of Paul are delivered to people who live in a sexist world, the kind of world where there's no guarantee that a man would even love his wife. And Paul's command that love was mandatory is revolutionary, because it challenges the status quo that a wife is simply property. By doing this, Paul affirms a woman's personhood. And he doesn't just command any sort of love either. Paul sets the bar rather high when he states that a husband is to love his wife with the same sense of self-sacrifice as Christ loved the church, going so far as to being willing to die for it. And we today have taken this idea to heart so well that most women today would never even contemplate entering a marriage unless they were 100% certain they were loved in return. And in the same way, most men have a strong conviction that they should love their wife to the point of being willing to die if they were defending them. So just keep in mind that these ideas that we take for granted, that love is at the center of a marriage, well, during the New Testament age, these ideas were both new and radical. So let's move on to the next step of a wedding. Eventually, the couple gets to the point where they want to make their relationship legally and sometimes religiously permanent. And when this happens, it is our custom for the guy to buy a diamond ring. Then he asks the girl to marry him by getting down on one knee. If she says yes, the couple is engaged. The woman starts wearing her engagement ring as a symbol of her choice, and there begins, for the next 2 weeks to probably a year or more, the most stressful planning that this couple will ever undertake, i.e. their wedding planning. But frequently, the guy will also ask the father of the bride to bless their engagement. Now, for our culture, this is usually a formality. I've never met a couple who's ever called off their wedding because the father of the bride refused to give his blessing. But in contrast, in the biblical accounts of engagements, a father's blessing is both mandatory and it comes at a price. The Hebrew word for this is mohar, and modern translations usually interpret this word as bride price or bridal endowment. This bride price could be paid in solid commodities such as gold or silver or trade goods, but it could also be arranged in exchange for physical labor or even an act of bravery. For example, Jacob agreed to work for his uncle for 14 years to marry both of his daughters. With regards to an act of bravery, in 1 Samuel 18, the king of Israel asked David to kill 100 Philistines and bring back their foreskins as proof of his deed. In return, David would get to marry Michal if he succeeded. So with all this in mind, I need you to think long and hard about this and let it sink in. In the Bible, a traditional marriage is an agreement between two men, the groom-to-be and the bride's father. And while exceptions do exist, the bride's opinion in the matter is rarely consulted, and at least when it came to her getting engaged. In a biblical engagement, the father of the bride is the only one in the equation who has to say yes. The bride's compliance is simply assumed thereafter. Now, in some older translations of the Bible, particularly in the King James Version, the word mohar is often mistranslated as the word dowry. Now today, linguistic scholars make a distinction between the mohar, which is the price the groom pays to the father of the bride, and the dowry, or the salutim, which is a wedding gift which is given to the bride from her family. The dowry, in many ways, was the wife's retirement package, and it was intended to provide the wife with financial security and a safety net in the event that her husband died or the husband divorced her for illegitimate reasons. Now, this dowry could also serve as a pledge of the wife's faithfulness to her husband, as she could lose the dowry and get divorced, and the husband would keep the dowry if he could prove that she cheated on him. It should also be noted that the dowry is very rarely mentioned in the biblical text, while the groom paying the bride price is a much more frequent occurrence. Now, the good news of all this is that once a bride price is paid, the marriage is technically in force, even though the couple is not yet sexually active. And we can see an example of this in Matthew's Gospel when Joseph discovered that Mary was pregnant while he was engaged, but she was still a virgin. And what this means is that Mary became pregnant in between the time when Joseph had paid his bride price, but before they had a chance to consummate their relationship sexually. Now, when Joseph learned that Mary was pregnant, he decided to break off his engagement quietly. And this required him to still get a divorce, even though absolutely no physical intimacies had taken place yet. Now, this too is a large departure from the way our culture views an engagement, which basically allows either the groom or the bride to back out of an engagement basically up until the time that they say "I do" and sign their paperwork. But one of the negative results of this practice of mohar is that the groom-to-be could often not afford to pay the bride price until much later in his life. And the result is that when men usually wed, they usually got married in their 30s or 40s, while girls were often married off as soon as they reached puberty. So keep in mind, the typical Old Testament wedding was usually between a 30 and 40-year-old man to a 14 to 17-year-old woman. Now, by the New Testament age, a legal document known as a ketubah could be drawn up between a groom-to-be and the bride's father. And this allowed the groom to pay a bride price at a later time, or even pay in installments. And just to give you a sense of perspective, most college students today take somewhere between 15 to 20 years to pay off their college loans. Can you imagine what this world would be like if no one could get married until they were debt-free and they were established in their occupation? Oh, and while we're on the subject of such speculation, don't go around thinking that if this were the case, that couples would just go ahead and have sex and worry about getting married later on in life. You know, kind of like how secular couples do nowadays. No, if this older system were still in place, the moment the couple had had premarital sex, even the first time, the groom-to-be owes the bride price to the father immediately, according to Exodus 22:16. And as an additional rub, if the father refused to give the man his daughter, he still owed the bride price. The result of all this was that the bride's father acted as the sexual gatekeeper for the family. If a man wanted to have sex with a woman, if he wanted to have a wife, he had to play by the dad's rules. So continuing on, let's talk about the actual wedding ceremonies themselves. For most couples, when the big day finally arrives, the couple has their ceremony. And this is where most young couples can easily blow between $5,000 and $100,000 to have that perfect day. And, well, in case you're curious, since you've been seeing a lot of my own wedding pictures, my wedding cost about $2,000, but then again, we did have Papa John's cater the whole thing. But what I'm getting at is this. Wedding ceremonies for us today are often one-day events. If we count the bachelor party and the bridal party from the night before, you could say that it's a 2-day event. But these kind of festivities rarely go for an entire week. And again, to offer a contrast, in the ancient Near East, wedding parties tended to be long, drawn-out affairs. Typically, they lasted at least 7 days. And the drinking of alcohol was expected. Now, if the supply of wine and strong drink ran out, this could become a serious embarrassment for the groom, because it was the groom who was expected to front the bill for the entire party for the entire week. Again, he had to be financially secure to get his wife, and this is one of the ways of him proving it. And this, of course, is the basis for Jesus' first recorded miracle in the Gospel of John. The groom, who lived in the city of Cana, did not plan to have enough white wine to supply for all of his guests, and he was about to suffer severe embarrassment for his lack of planning. Of course, as the text of John records, Jesus saves the day by producing somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. Also keep in mind that this was considered a good quality of wine, the kind that would get you very drunk, at least according to the head steward over the party. My guess is that it was at least enough wine to keep the party going for at least another week, maybe longer. Now, in the middle of the whole wedding ceremony, the last stage is the vow, the rings, and the kiss, the actual ceremony itself. And simply put, a couple usually vows that they will be faithful to one another for as long as they shall live. They then exchange wedding rings, and they may even light a unity candle. In some cases, they may even take communion together. Once all of the I-dos are said, the preacher, or the justice of the peace, gives the couple permission to kiss. If you were curious in any sort, you may wonder, when does the modern couple become legally married? Well, the answer is, When the state issues the wedding license and the couple, along with the person performing the marriage, who has the authority to solemnize their marriage, as soon as all three people sign the document. However, for most Christians, they usually consider the couple married when the official wedding or the officiate says, "I now pronounce you man and wife," and then says, "You may kiss your bride," even though the signing of the document usually happens at a different time. Now, I've gone through all of this simply to bring up the issue that there's no single agreed upon magic moment, even for our culture, when the couple officially becomes husband and wife. Legally, it happens when they sign the paperwork and they get it notarized. And only three people have to be there: the husband, the wife, and the guy signing the paperwork and offering his stamp to say he solemnized it. For most people's religious sensibilities, however, the couple becomes man and wife when the words, "I now pronounce you man and wife," are declared. And sometimes they even will say the couple isn't married until the couple has had their first evening of sex after the wedding ceremony. So here's the part in the lecture where I get to blow your mind for the week. Did you know that not only is it ambiguous for our culture when the couple becomes husband and wife, but it's also ambiguous in the Bible, that the Bible does not say exactly when the couple becomes husband and wife. Now, technically, they are married the moment the bride price is paid. But our culture has a hard time picturing that the couple could be considered married if they haven't had sex yet. Additionally, one of the first recorded marriage ceremonies, oh, and boy, do I use the term loosely, is very, very terse and short. In Genesis 24, Isaac and Rebekah meet for the first time. The bride price has already been paid for Rebekah at an earlier time. In fact, Isaac wasn't even there for that negotiation. And they simply go to the tent that used to belong to Isaac's mother, and they have sex. In this wedding ceremony, there are no vows, no rings, no special attire save for the veil that Rebekah wears. Simply put, in this wedding ceremony, two people simply say hello, go to a tent, and become one flesh through sexual intercourse. Whew, alrighty then, you still with me? By this point in the lecture, I hope you're feeling two things. Firstly, I hope you're feeling like the biblical world of family relations is a strange sort of place, and that it's very different from our own time and from our own customs. And hopefully this will happen to you in every lecture during this course. The Bible was written in a time and to a culture that was very different from our own. And many of the facts that we will learn in this course should strike you as strange. This is quite normal, and it supports my initial claim from the first lecture that the Bible is important to us today, but it was not written directly to us today. But secondly, I hope you experience a certain amount of cognitive dissonance at the moment. And by that I mean that your values about marriage and family should be clashing with some of the values that are native to the ancient culture of the Bible. If you are like me and you come from a Restoration Movement perspective, this may really set you on edge because you are realizing that our Western Christian values and culture are still very distant from the New Testament and Old Testament views on marriage and family. And if you are of the same mindset as me, you're probably starting to ask questions like, well, goodness, shouldn't we be restoring the ancient culture? Shouldn't we be trying to go back to these ancient traditions? But then the question becomes, if so, which ones? And it's at this point that our lecture, we can begin to ask some theological questions of this biblical data. And I will attempt to model this method of crossing the gap between the original meaning of the biblical text and how it applies to our culture today. And in particular, we will discuss the theological implications of polygamy and this idea that has become a buzzword for us, this idea of traditional marriage. So with all that being said, at the beginning of the lecture, I promised that we would discuss this hot-button topic of traditional marriage, and so here we go. The first hurdle we come to when we look at all this biblical data is that some of the legitimate ways that a marriage could be defined in the Bible today would be either immoral or illegal. For example, in Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 through 29, If a rapist was caught, he is forced to marry the woman that he raped. The couple can never get divorced, and the rapist must pay the father 50 shekels of silver, a very high bride price. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm glad that laws like this are not followed today. Likewise, there are more than 24 examples of polygamy in the Bible, and most of them at least seem to come with God's approval, so long as the husband treats all of his wives equally well. And as the chart on this slide shows, there are several scenarios besides our traditional one man, one woman for the rest of their life that do constitute a legal and legitimate biblical marriage. And keep in mind that every one of these, as pictured in this slide, besides the Levirate law or the kinsman-redeemer marriage, they would be illegal if they happen in America today. And so the question I would like to pose is, well, how do we respond to this? Well, let's start off by looking for an interpretive key that is provided by Jesus himself. This quote comes from Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9. In this passage, the Pharisees ask Jesus an interpretive question about the law of Moses. They ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Now, this was a common question that the Pharisees were asking during Jesus' day. One group of Pharisees, who followed a rabbi named Shammai, believed that it was only possible for a couple to get a divorce if the woman had physically committed adultery on her husband. The other group of Pharisees, who followed a teaching of a rabbi named Hillel, taught that if the woman did anything that displeased her husband, it could be considered grounds for divorce. And from this text, we gather that the group that Jesus is taking questions from is allied with the Hillel group, because when Jesus sides with Shammai's interpretation, they've already anticipated the answer, and their next question is already ready to go. And that question is this: then why did Moses command to give a certificate of dismissal and divorce? The Pharisees have jumped to the heart of the issue. They're basically asking, if God did not intend for divorce, why does he allow it? Why did God, through Moses, allow a divorce to happen at all if God doesn't want to see divorces happen? Now, Jesus' answer, in my opinion, is both brilliant and troublesome. It is brilliant because it focuses on the problem of human sin and the problem of hard-heartedness. He states that Moses only gave permission for a couple to get a divorce because the people were wicked. The problem was not with God's will. The problem was that people like to go against God's will. And because they do this, it required writing of laws to keep these people in check. But here's where it becomes troubling. Notice just what Jesus has done here. He has basically said that there are some laws in the Old Testament that are not indications of God's will at all. Instead, they are laws that are designed to keep human evil and hard-heartedness from getting out of control. And I would like to submit to you today that with regards to both polygamy and patriarchy, many of the laws found in the Old Testament regulate these customs, and that they share much in common with this divorce law that Jesus has just upended here in Matthew 19. Because all of these laws seem more aimed at regulating bad situations, instead of trying to reveal what is God's ideal for human behavior. So, let's actually discuss a theology for polygamy. Like we said, polygamy is never condemned in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. So, in case you're curious, here is the logic for why polygamy has bad idea written all over it. Firstly, the Bible doesn't record a single instance of a happy polygamist. When a man has multiple wives, these wives will fight over his sexual devotion. And we can see this, for example, between Leah and Rachel in Genesis chapter 30, where Leah basically asked her sister, look, isn't it enough for you that you've stolen my husband? Another problem that comes up is the children. When a man has children by different wives, there's going to be a strong sense of competition for the inheritance and for the paternal attention. And we see this with Jacob and his children in Genesis 37. And sometimes these children of separate wives will fight not just meanly, but viciously, so much so that they will kill one another. And we see this happening with David's son Absalom in 2 Samuel 13. In short, the overwhelming witness of the Bible is that polygamy causes family division and strife, and it does not yield happiness. So, a second argument against polygamy goes like this. All of the laws in the Old Testament that do mention polygamy only attempt to regulate the practice, rather than support it. For example, in Deuteronomy 17, we are explicitly told that the king of Israel may not marry multiple wives or many wives, because if he does, they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And we see this prediction come true in 1 Kings 11 with King Solomon. Another example, the law from Exodus 21:10 that we saw earlier in our lecture. This law is specifically geared to protect the wife in a polygamist relationship who is least favored. For example, a husband who has a least favored wife, he cannot neglect to give her food. He must continue to give her shelter and clothing. He must even continue to satisfy her needs sexually. And all of this paints a picture that there is quite a lot of possibility for abuse when it comes to polygamy. And this is why I suggested that polygamy laws fall into the same category as the divorce law that Jesus cited in Matthew 19. These laws exist to limit human evil. They do not give blanket permissions. A third and more practical argument against polygamy goes like this. The practice of polygamy makes it almost impossible for a society to have a single standard of sexual morality. For example, if a man is allowed to take multiple wives, then the only way he can really commit adultery is if he sleeps with a woman who is already married. Theoretically, it would be possible for him to attempt to court as many women as he wants, and so long as he obeys the rules and doesn't sleep with them until after he is married, he's technically not committing adultery. And this creates a vicious double standard because, as we pointed out earlier, a woman could not do the same thing. And any sexual activity for the woman outside of her lawful marriage is always considered adultery. And one of my suggestions here is, by doing away with polygamy, it is the only way to actually make sure that we have a truly equitable condition for men and women, that we are enforcing the same standard of sexual morality across the board. Alrighty, so let's now look at a couple New Testament examples of why polygamy is not such a great idea. And the first text we'll look at is Paul's regulations on elders and deacons in the local church, as he's written to his friend Timothy. Now, in both of these cases, for elders and deacons, Paul says that to have this office, the person has to be a one-woman man. And this indicates that a polygamist cannot hold either of these offices. Now, keep in mind, this is not a prohibition for everybody in the church, but it does suggest that there is something fundamentally wrong with polygamy, that it somehow makes a Christian leader open to being reproached or rebuked by other people. Now, again, this text by itself cannot carry the weight of a proof text. It may simply be Paul's reaction to the way things are at Rome. For example, in Roman culture, and this is pagan Roman, by the way, they only allowed for a man to have one legal wife. And Paul may simply be saying that he wants the elders and deacons of the church to be one-woman men, simply to not cause problems with the Gentiles. But to bolster Paul's argument, many theologians have turned again to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19 that we saw earlier in the lecture. This type of argument that Jesus makes is known as an appeal to the created order. Jesus quotes the passage from Genesis chapter 2, and he concludes that the original couple did not get divorced. Therefore, staying married for life is God's ideal, is the way that Jesus argues. And many theologians have taken this form of argument, and they've run with it, explaining that since the first couple was also heterosexual and monogamous, mainly by virtue that they had no other alternatives, then this too must be the ideal. Now, while I do find this argument convincing, I must acknowledge that it is by no means airtight. Matthew 19, 4 through 5 is specifically talking about divorce. And while postulates or spin-offs based on Jesus' logic are valid speculation, they are simply that, speculation. Additionally, it is another thing to argue that an ideal should be made applicable to all people. We run into this problem with Paul in his 1 Timothy passage. It is one thing to hold a church leader to a very high standard of monogamy. It is another thing to say that all believers must be held to that same standard. And, for example, in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul argues that the ideal relationship for Christians is not even marriage at all, but celibacy, meaning never getting married, never having sex. And so my point here is this. If a Christian wanted to argue that the ideal is not polygamy, that exact same argument could be used to say that monogamous marriage is not the Christian ideal either. So, now that we've looked at a lot of the biblical data concerning polygamy, here's my conclusion on the matter. It's true, the Bible never says don't do it. And quite frankly, the argument for why it's wrong is complicated. The church has historically condemned polygamy because all of the Bible data points that it's not a great idea. And personally, I think they made the correct choice by both refusing to sanction it and by reprimanding people who even attempted it. It really does cut down on all kinds of problems. But in all of this, I want you to notice the distinction that I've just made between historical theology, what the church has taught, and biblical theology, what the Bible actually says. In this class, I promised you that we would be learning how to do biblical theology, and that we would be learning to read the Bible better. And because of this, I need you to be able to spot these kind of differences between these arguments. So, I guess now we should probably wrap all this up and tie a nice bow around it. Here's where things may get a little controversial, but please just reserve your comments for the discussion forum. First, let's start off with this theological issue of traditional marriage. In our culture, it has become a buzzword basically since the 1960s, and it's a call for conservatives that they should defend traditional marriage. Well, let me just say for the record that in light of everything that we've just learned about biblical marriage traditions, I can say I honestly don't want a traditional marriage. And I dare say that you do not want one either. For example, ladies, I'm pretty sure you want to have a choice in who you're going to marry. But if you had a traditional marriage, your marriage is arranged for you, and probably no one is going to be asking your opinion on the matter. They'll be more concerned whether the person paid your bride price or not. Likewise, fellas, I'm pretty sure you don't want to have to live in a world where you had to raise the money it takes to get a wife. If I could just give you one example. In Thailand, the practice of bride price is still being used even today. And one of my friends from CCU, who is from Thailand, was also engaged. And she was going to college in the United States, but her groom-to-be, who was still living in Thailand, had already paid her bride price. But he had to wait and wait and wait until she was done with college. She took 6 years to get done, by the way. But you may be asking, how much did he have to pay? Well, she said that he had paid the equivalent of $185,000 American dollars. $185,000. Think about that. Do you really want to live in a world where you have to raise enough cash to purchase a bride? Do you want to live in a world where a father could sue you for this kind of money if you eloped with his daughter without getting permission to marry her? So, if I may, let me sum this up with a public service announcement. We Christians are being intellectually lazy and or dishonest when we use the phrase traditional marriage. Because what most people really mean when they use this term is they want marriages to look like marriages from the time period between 1880 and 1955 in America. In fact, most people would probably be horrified if they actually lived in a world that had traditional ancient Near Eastern marriage customs. So please, don't use this term without stating which tradition you mean. It's really not as cut and dried as most conservative Americans would like to believe. And I assert that the only way to get people, and especially non-believers, to respect the biblical teaching on the subject at all, is that when we present it, we must be honest and open that it is a complex topic. And lastly, a topic like marriage and family shows us just how different we are from these cultures of the biblical world. And this theme of difference between us and them will keep coming up time and time again in this class. And so I particularly want you to get in the habit of wrestling with these kind of issues.